Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you are listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. So today we're doing the most fun topic you could possibly study in the Bible or talk about. It's not controversial at all. There's no possibility for any hurt feelings. It's, you know, how a certain type of people love to talk about clear. And the Bible is very clear about something, and there's no nuance. It's just super easy to talk about, and won't get anybody in trouble. Or, it's just super easy. So we're talking about divorce. If you hadn't already guessed. So Jason, before we get to the passage today. What has been your relationship with divorce? What's been your experience with divorce?
Yeah, so my parents got a divorce when I was 10. It was a long time coming, and it was pretty messy. My dad was a minister to church. They had just planted that church. A lot of good energy. The church was growing for that area of the country. And per their expectations, it was growing probably 2 or 3 times faster than they anticipated. And things were going really well for them. And then my dad had an affair. And once that happened, because of the nature of the way the church community worked, his job there was over immediately. And their marriage was soon over after that. And it, like many marriages, that final thing that's what it is. There's 100 things that lead up to it, and that was the final thing. Yeah,
I'll talk about my parents' divorce here in a moment, but how I always describe the kind of final moment to my mom was, and this could be applicable for you and the affair, it was more like the anvil that broke the camel's back, which is what I always like to say.
Yeah. So even as a kid, and when you're a kid, you just kind of think, I mean, you might see something on TV that's different than your experience, but you just assume that's probably within the realm of normal because it's what you know. And to my parents' credit, I wouldn't characterize this at all as experiencing, any kind of real abuses and in those kind of terms, that often will happen in volatile households. So, and really the divorce was somewhat how do I say this? It brought peace to the house in many ways because there had been tension for years. And it was the remarriages that both my parents were remarried. And now I have a good relationship with everybody involved. But at the time, it was very threatening. I didn't like the notion of being in a blended family. We didn't even call them blended families. There was nobody really to help. We never had counseling. And we ended up in several different custody problems. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to. Yeah, so that's what happened there.
Sure.
And so, it was, and the other piece of it is when in the world I grew up in, if you're meeting people for the first time, you'll get asked about your parents. And my dad went into preaching a few years after he got a divorce. He remarried, went into preaching, and I had to field multiple questions on, how is your dad able to preach if he's divorced? And I wish I would have had the wherewithal to say, you should ask my dad. Why am I having to answer your question of that? And they weren't kind questions, let me put it that way. So it was like I was offending them directly by my dad's existence in that role. Very negative and very, just in general, it was a subject you would always avoid talking about simply because lots of landmines, and it tended to be one of those gotcha questions if you're doing an interview of any sort. So what about you?
That's really good. And I think maybe we'll touch later on the question of how we think it affects how we view our own marriages. I think that'd be really interesting to talk about. So for me, it was almost exactly 10 years ago. My parents separated. They'd been together for 30 plus years. I feel bad that I don't know that. They've been together for 30 plus years, had 4 children. And maybe like a year or so before they got separated, my dad had gone to my mom and told my mom that he was a woman. He'd always been a woman, that this was, who my dad was. This was the experience that was my dad's experience. and they went to counseling for a little while to see if they could reconcile, and just it really ended up being one of those things where it just wasn't. Neither of their life. When my dad made that decision to pursue transitioning and following through with that, the trajectories of what they wanted out of life and how they saw marriage and how they saw their relationship together are just irreconcilable. And they got separated when I was 16, I want to say. I two older brothers who were already adults away at college, and I had a younger sister, and I was 16, so I obviously was not away at college. And yeah, it was really fascinating because we, maybe up until I was about 10 years old, had a pretty good family dynamic. I think I've talked about in other podcasts. We kind of had just a really couple nasty years where lost a lot of family members, a lot of sickness, a lot of pain and agony. And there was this sense that my dad had kind of taken a step back from the family. And honestly, the year or so prior, before my dad and mom got divorced, it was one of those things that there was this underlying tension and underlying depression in the household. I've even heard my dad, and my dad's not a believer, I've heard my dad talk about how the house at that time felt like my dad would not phrase it this way, but it felt like he was trying to, my dad tried to find this phrase of like almost demonic, like it felt like our house was under this oppression. And so I did not expect, well, obviously my dad to become, my dad to transition to be a trans woman. That's not what my expectation was. And I wasn't expecting my parents to get divorced because it's been 30 years or so. At a certain point, I guess I've always just been like, well, you're gonna, it's just what it is at that point. To be fair, they were like early 50s. So it wasn't like, writing on the wall, it's all over and just packing in for the next 30 years and accept your fate. But I was not expecting it. But when they did get divorced, there was this sense of like, oh, okay. A lot of puzzle pieces are clicking together in terms of what I thought about my parents' marriage, about things about my dad and things about my mom, and so they got divorced maybe pretty shortly after they separated. And yeah, there was this sense. It was really weird because suddenly it was just me and my mom and my sister, and whereas before we've been a family of 6, and now we're a family of 3, and navigating what this all means. And for me, I've talked before about, man, what does it mean to be a man when your father, the half the male portion that provided life for you, no longer claims that. Like, what is it? Who do you look to? How do you see yourself? And a lot of anger towards my dad, a lot of anger towards how he hurt my mom, and how he hurt me. But just a lot of pain and a lot of anger. Ultimately, a lot of redemption in that story, and I've shared that before. But God is making all things new, and He's working all things for good. And I think most of my family is in a healthier place now than they were, but still very up close and personal to see the devastation of what that rendering of the one flesh can look like in a family. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it is one of those dynamics that it's all mixed up. I don't have a struggle today and say this is solely the result of one bad experience in 1982, and I picked that year at random. So I don't know what happened in 1982 officially, but anyway, the point there is it's all mixed up. And so at times I'm like, is this because of the divorce? Is this something that's innate in me?
Yeah.
I mean, just a weakness that I don't know, it was there genetically, kind of thing. But I do know it is, at the very least, it's how do I say this? It makes everything shaky, and it makes you question things. And had my parents stayed married, I would have had another set of problems for sure.
Sure.
But there is some uniqueness in that unsettling. Now, the challenge is now when you say this, how many people will listen to this and their biological parents are still married? And so we adjust to whatever we're raised in, And so now I've been married nearly 27 years this month. And I love the thought that my kids have not experienced that shakiness. And I love the thought, and I can't predict what's going to happen 5 and 10 years from now, but the way our approach to marriage, I think it's a little bit foolhardy to say has totally made us divorce-proof. But I do think the way we process problems gives us enormous hope and increasing hope. And so I see that as a gift that I've given to my kids that I can tell you of other problems I certainly passed on to them. It's good, because that produces a fracturing of something that God intended to speak stability and represent stability in life.
I love, and we'll probably talk a little bit more, and I'll transition here in a second. But I love the beauty. You talk about the fracturing of something that God did not intend to fracture, and yet because of your experience, you have now been probably much more intentional and been equipped with better tools and better experiences to where you can make sure that stays forged together for your kids. And that's just one of those cool things that we get to see God doing, because, who knows if you hadn't been through that experience, if you would have the same tools, the same motivations, the same ability to work through and provide your kids with the right backdrop that they were always meant to experience. And so I'm excited to see what this has. Honestly, who knows? This was a longer intro than we almost always do. I wouldn't even call it an intro. It's more of a chapter 1 sort of thing. So maybe we'll stick it at the end or the beginning or the middle. Who knows? But I appreciate anybody listening. It's one of those funny things that you don't know. Because on one hand, I feel like I'm talking to Jason and being vulnerable. But on the other hand, I'm like, oh, there's a lot of people that are going to hear some of the most vulnerable thoughts. Going to hear about the most vulnerable mode of my entire life. And so that's always funny. So I appreciate you in advance for handling with care and love and all that good stuff.
Today we're going to be looking at Matthew 19, and I think we'll focus our comments just on verses 3 through 9. I think that's how we'll do that today. Beginning there, some Pharisees came to Jesus to test Jesus. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh.' So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." "Why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery." So, in processing that, what amazes you about this interaction?
The joining together in marriage, becoming one flesh, is one of the more mind-bending realities of how God has set up his creation. And even leaning into being a follower of Jesus, what it looks like, what does it truly look like to be joined in one flesh? It reminds me a lot of the question of what does it really look like when you have the Holy Spirit dwelling inside of you? That's kind of it's a similar sort of question, because I think about my, the relationship I have with my wife. There are times where I feel like, man, we totally embody this idea. I feel like we're making these decisions, we're on the same page, we're together, or even things are going really badly, but we're choosing to lean in and choosing to do all these things. And yet there's so many different states. And so the state isn't what dictates if somebody is flesh. Whether we're mad or angry isn't what dictates whether we're one flesh. It's the same sort of thing. Whether I'm, if I mess up and I choose not to follow God in this moment and choose to follow God in the next moment, it's not that the Holy Spirit is jumping in and out of me in those. And so this dynamic is really fascinating, because obviously this is one of the first things that God creates. It's one of the first things that he instills before there are cities, before there are countries, before there are governments, before there are children. In God's design, there is this marriage. And I think there's a lot of people who put marriage on, they worship it as an idol. And so maybe we'll talk about that at some point. So I don't want you to think, listener, that that's where I'm going with this, but just the seriousness and just the foundational aspect of it, that it's so massive, just like the Holy Spirit dwelling inside of us is so massive. And we have these touchstones of do I have the fruit of the Spirit? Here's my question is there a version that we can check in with our relationship with our spouse of is there a fruit of marriage, if that makes sense? Is that helps me when I'm like, okay, am I living in the Spirit? And I can go through the list of the fruits of the Spirit, be like, okay, yeah, I'm seeing evidence of this, I'm seeing evidence of that. I'm not seeing evidence of that. And so for me, just that this is so important, so big, and yet it's so broad and it's so nebulous at times. On the one hand, I think some days when my marriage feels not as like absolutely rock solid, or it feels not even rock solid, just feels frustrating. That nebulous kind of broad definition or broad description feels frustrating, because I want to know what puzzle piece I need to plug in to make my marriage feel like it's fitting the right description. But on days like today, when I feel really in sync with my wife, and it seems a lot more beautiful. So what today is amazing to me, tomorrow could very well be perplexing.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot there. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I love all that. It took my mind in two ways. One thing is, if you're married to a person, and most people, at least initially, are, that they were like, this person makes life better, then you've probably had some of your best experiences with that person. And the challenge with being human is, once you've had a fantastic experience, a good experience doesn't feel that great. So but it's not human to think I'm going to string together 5 million fantastic experiences, that will comprise my life. So that's part of the dynamic. It's like anything. If you're in a job and the first week or so, you just have to push a button and you're chilling, and then from then on, the real job is, no, you got to do something that takes a lot of energy. You will always fantasize about having those first 2 weeks again.
Absolutely.
And I think that's sometimes a corollary. The other thing is, and this really relates, it's just me putting words to that dynamic of it feeling like it's so much. When Jesus says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, he's acknowledging there are these 4 distinct, overlapping, but distinct components of you and how you are. Because he just could have said, love God with all you got, but he was articulating this. And many times I think, okay, if I can just get the mental relationship right, I'm going to think right about this. But then you got, I've got to feel right about it. And then physically I got to do that, and that could be staying healthy or attending to the affection in your marriage or doing the chores around your house, all those kind of things. And then now you have this soul, this spiritual level. And how do we even quantify that? What are the metrics for that, And one flesh is not referring to, typically we think about sexuality when one flesh, because that's a physical embodiment, but he's not saying that. He's saying that that's part of it, but he's saying heart, soul, mind, and strength on the one flesh. And I think it's useful to me because it's overwhelming in the sense that, man, I've grown so much. I've been married all these years, but still I'm like, oh, this part is better. If I was able to objectively compare it to our first year of marriage, I'd be like, oh yeah, this is better. But I still would want it to be better than it is.
That's a great that really, I think that could really help me in the future, in terms of just having a set of things to really check in with myself and with my marriage of, am I embodying loving my wife with my heart, soul, mind, and strength, and that I think that's going to be really helpful for me, because all 4 together, I can't even begin to process how those weave together, what that absolutely looks like. But I know when one thing isn't right, or I usually can know when one thing is not in check, and we'll spend a lot of time working on one thing in one area, to make sure that we are fully invested, in terms of soul, or in terms of whatever. And then we work on that. We feel like we get to a really good place, and then we turn around and this other area is not working. So I really appreciate that. So the first thing that you said about, not being able to string all these amazing experiences together, on the one hand, that's incredibly frustrating. And my wife and I have had this conversation before of, it's such a weird thing to think about, that so there's this biological thing that happens to us, that when we fall in love with a person, there's this like basically 1 to 3 year span where we have these outrageous chemicals pumping through our body to connect us to this person. And then for some people it lasts longer, for some people it lasts shorter. Eventually those feelings that cause the butterflies, that cause the heart tingles or whatever, eventually those begin to fade or transform into other feelings. And because of how intense those feelings are moment to moment, there can be this sense of loss, and there can be this sense of there can be this sense of loss, and we can stop in a moment and realize, okay, man, the love that I have now is so much more deeper and so much more profound and so much more sacrificial. But we have this. I feel like a lot of us, and I feel the same way too. When you think back to that first week of the job or the first year of your relationship or whatever it may be, there's this sense. There's this sense that was always what it was meant to be. That there's a corruption that this isn't continuing for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. I'm not having those that same biological reaction that I was having then. And yet it's so incredible to me that God sets it up in the way that he does, so that the deeper love, the more profound connection, the way that we grow together is not by a million fantastic moments, it's by this slow progression and the choosing of love, as opposed to the driving force of, and to be fair, it's all chemicals in our brain, but you know what I mean, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I have read, people that have done research on the seasons of marriage, and if you don't appreciate the seasons of marriage, you will be miserable, but you won't get to that deep sense of safety and contentedness, without going through these seasons, and so that's really important. That God's design is really, it's ingenious, but we are constantly evaluating God's design from our perspective and what it feels like in this millisecond, and we make decisions about, well, I'm not going to be happy unless this happens. Mm-hmm. And then God's like, no, I could lead you to happiness, but that's not going to happen. Like, that's not good for you,
That's good.
And it happens in lots more than marriage, but it shows up there, and it's more important to us because this is our person, and we feel like if we can't get this right, what does this mean about everything else?
That's really good. And yeah, so I've always given the advice, like I've given 1,000 people. I've given like 5 people this advice, maybe 10.
But every time
I've given this advice of like, okay, how, it's always a funny question in the Christian dating world. Okay, how long should you be, dating before you get married? And the world now, it's like 4 or 5, 6, it's a long time before you get married. And then there's, cohabitation in that. But like, let's just say for argument's sake, you're not following that path, and you're intentionally seeking after each other to be these, to be what God calls us to be in marriage. And I've talked to, a handful of couples that are along this path, and you get this question of, okay, how, when do we know that we're ready to get married? And I've always come back to the advice of go through at least more than one season together, and I don't even think you have to go through like 100 or several different, but just at some point, whether that's 3 months or 2 years or whatever time frame it looks like, if the span of your relationship has existed on one even plane that whole time, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. And not even like you're setting yourself up for divorce, but you're setting yourself up for a much harder marriage is how I've always thought about it. And that could be terrible advice, I don't know. Should I stop telling people that, Jason?
No, I think that's right. I think one of the biggest challenges is God does have a plan for each of us, and we talked about this in many other podcasts. Our goal isn't to master it, it's to trust him. The challenge is most of the time we spend very little time actually listening, and so we come to God to some degree in a panic and be like, tell me right now everything I need to know right now because I need to know it right now, and God could, but he knows that makes him a genie if every time you come to him and demand an answer.
I got the image of, if I'm sure none of our listeners ever did this, or you didn't do it, but you didn't do the homework the night before, and so you run up at, like right before school starts in 7th grade trying to find somebody who had the homework to copy off of.
I resist comment on that.
Yeah. So what amazes you?
So, yeah, what's interesting to me is, number one, I don't even know how to put this together quickly in my head, but just clearly the Pharisees are not asking because they care. They're asking to test him, which translates in my mind. They're asking him to trap him, And my assumption is that if he says, you can't do it, then it's like, well, wait a minute, God said, or you can't get divorced. Well, what about Moses? And now they put him at odds with Moses. Or if you say you can or can't do it, if you agree with Moses, then you're against God. If you agree with God, then you're against Moses. And I love, that's amazing to me. This is one more application of this, how Jesus gets to the heart of the question, despite the fact that they don't care. They don't want this answer, They just want to trap him. And he not only sidesteps their trap, but he also gives us valuable information, which it's just a funny thing. It's so hard for me to assess, hey, somebody's trying to trap me, number one. Number two, it's really hard then to craft an answer that has any value other than sidestepping. And then clearly there's other passages we've covered where they'll ask for something of Jesus. He's like, I'll answer that once you answer this. So he's trying to do this. And right after this, he engages in a conversation with his own disciples. We didn't go there because of our time. But it is this idea how he's still instructive and how he goes to the root. And this is where the thing that I think we have so much trouble at, where we often function from the Pharisees' perspective. We are looking at the anomalies. We are looking at the exceptions. You know what I mean? God is always looking at, here's the standard. And by standard, I mean, here's the way God set this up to work in a healthy and beautiful way. Because if I go in and in this case, of course, the woman is not mentioned, meaning she has no power, So any and every reason, well, that's a lot of reasons, And so, but it's like a person, when they introduce them, they say, well, this is their first marriage. It's like, well, what are you anticipating, And I think there's that similar part, and it has to do with humans, in this case, men, but these humans being in charge. And what's interesting is Jesus' answer emphasizes God being in charge. He says he made them male and female. And it says later, therefore what God has joined together, not that who you fell in love with. And I hope we felt those feelings. God built those feelings in to kind of draw us in, the chemicals and the other dynamics that you're speaking of. And this is God's work, God set this in motion. And then when they ask specifically about Moses, he's like, yeah, you did this. Humans did this. And it also shows, and that's kind of amazing, that God actually adjusted his standards per what the people could do, which we would call situational ethics, which that's always been condemned. But this is an example of God saying, here's my standard. It's like polygamy. It's like one man, one woman. What about David? One man, one woman. What about Solomon? What about Jacob? For goodness sake, somebody tell this guy, And yet God worked through them despite the fact they didn't meet the standard. So what that speaks to me is, number one, there is a standard. There's a way that this will work more beautifully and powerfully if I align myself with God. Also, God loves me so much, he works with where I am. And so if you're hearing this and you've been divorced, understand, I've yet to talk to a divorced person that if you were to go back in time and you were to have these skills that now, and the knowledge you have now, and you might not have chosen that person, but you would have preferred not to go through a divorce. I don't know of any divorced person that say, nope, I just love that high of divorce. You know what I mean? And so they would agree that it wasn't what they were hoping for, And so it's for those of us that, whether divorced or not to condemn the person that's divorced, because God's not condemning the person that's divorced. All he's saying is, this is the standard that will lead to the most beauty and power and peace. But when you can't do that or won't do that, God adjusts to where you are. He doesn't change the standard, but he adjusts. And I think that's just amazing. It just shows it's how you stand with truth and grace simultaneously.
Man, that is so beautiful. Because I think about how this has been used before as this bludgeon, as this set into as I need to conform other people to this box. And if this box is taken away, or if somebody colors outside of the lines, then it's this worst possible thing. I never thought about this until you were talking, but Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. And I had this. So, and then Jesus goes on to talk about sexual morality being a reason for divorce. And I had this sense, I was like, okay, what is it? I'd have to do a word study, but what does it mean here when Jesus says that Moses allowed them for divorce when their hearts were hard? Like, how would you describe, like, for me, if I were to describe some guy coming home and beating on his wife, I would describe that as a hard heart. Or if somebody was emotionally gaslighting and abusive and repeatedly so and unforgiving, I would tend to describe that as a hard heart. And so I love the fact one, it makes me so angry how many times I've been led to believe that the words of Jesus were these ironclad bars that wanted to lock you in, and that if you put an arm outside of the bar, then Jesus had no place for you, or had no understanding, or had no grace for you. So one, it makes me mad how Jesus' teachings on divorce have been so used as a tool of abuse and of control. But two, it is so incredible to me how Jesus communicates this love, how Jesus communicates love in this way. The way that Jesus holds these two tensions together and doesn't sacrifice is just absolutely beautiful. And I think you really helped enlighten that for me, that Jesus is so capable here of holding the tension of the truth while also not letting go of grace. And that is, man, that the way he does that is like, we so often talk about men training. Like for me, I feel like I need to really sit at the feet here and be intentional about this tension that Jesus is able to hold together.
I think everything you said, I'm like, yeah. And we have to keep realizing there's a percentage. If you're serious about following Christ, there's a percentage of truth in you, and there's a percentage of falseness. And much of the falseness you didn't seek. It was given to you. And this is not a condemnation about people that passed it on, whether they meant to or not. It's simply that I'm saying that's beside the point for our conversation right now. It's simply about being open to say, I have this view of God, or these aspects that God created, and I may only be locking in 20% of the full truth here. I don't know, and that's the humility when Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit. That's people that are aware that they have nothing to offer spiritually to God. And I think that's our safe space, And so with marriage, we have to marriage or divorce, we have to recognize there's a certain amount of truth that we know, but then there's probably a larger percentage, depending on your upbringing, depending on who you've allowed to teach you, that may be really, really twisted. That word immorality. So I'll transition to perplexed. And it is perplexing to think through that word, sexual immorality. It's interesting. I was just looking at the passage that had that. I need to go back to it. I walked away from it for just a second.
Is it pornea or is it?
Yeah, it is. And that's where we get the word pornography. But the general, when you look at the definitions, or the way it's translated, maybe better said, sexual. There's not one word for sexual and one word for morality. It's just one word, porneia, and it's fornication, whoredom, which is a word that doesn't pop up much, met, which I'm not quite understanding there. And maybe that's an abbreviation for idolatry. It's an abbreviation and says idolatry. And I think what that's saying is, I can't remember what the word met stands for right there at the second, but it's the idea of representative. Here's another way it's used. So when you're applying this, so let's say we're talking to a person that says, my marriage is terrible. We used to use the terminology in the Church of Christ, at least, grounds for divorce. You know what I mean? So can I get out? Well, part of that is the why, and a huge part of it is the why, is this because it's so easy to not be long-suffering, and there are things that I've seen marriages 100% ruined because people just made the decision, I deserve to be happy. You know what I mean? And the fact of the matter is that that's not a reason to get a divorce. Simultaneously, there are things that spouses will do that are idolatrous, in many cases worshiping themselves, that are sinful, are grounds for divorce, and you become unhappy because of that. So unhappiness and feelings in general are not invalid. You just have to dig deeper. But it is challenging because God will use, I always go back to Hosea, where he's saying, hey, I want you to marry this lady who keeps running off from you so that this will be a picture of my relationship. And he calls them adulterers, the nation adulterers. And yeah, there were some that were having, some kind of temple prostitution kind of thing. So there was a physical thing, but God's not, that's not the main issue, is their hearts that were far from him. So, but even if you're just talking about sexual immorality, to be sexually faithful to your spouse, and I'm coming from specifically a husband's perspective to his wife, you're talking about eliminating all others. You know what I mean? And that's true of just people that are lusted after, pornography, and clearly having sex with someone outside your marriage.
What? I'm just kidding.
Yes.
I'm sorry. That was my maturity following up.
There you go. But it includes all that. But it also includes being faithful to what you know. If you know your wife is driven crazy because you just spend recklessly, or you guys have some things, that undermines. See, for men in particular, the emotional, men can gather emotion from the sexual experience. Women need to feel safe prior to it. So this is where this gets difficult, because if a person is tearing down their spouse, they're not having sex with someone outside their marriage, but they're constantly tearing down their spouse. I can see that being a valid reason to think, wait a minute, this is immoral compared to what their call was. But see, we have this limited, what's the least I have to do to pass this class kind of feel with our Christianity. And that's a dynamic that really, really hurts us, And it happens both ways, where on one hand, I don't need to be thinking the least. What's the least I can do for my spouse that she didn't have a reason to leave me? If two people are committed to a godly relationship guided by biblical principles, and that's not of God. That's sinning. It's sinning for me to say, what's the minimum level I can do? Simultaneously, it's sinful for another spouse to say, I need to starve this person of all affection, so eventually they'll go and have sex with somebody else. You know what I mean? To set that up. But the challenge with that is the whole relationship has been pitched as wrong, because church doesn't do well on teaching sexuality. Church doesn't do well about being honest about marriage. Church doesn't do well. So many of us start with badly inherited teachings or expectations of marriage, because when I don't tell you honestly about something that you're about to experience, you assume it went easy for me. You assume it was the fairy tale for me. Even saying it out loud might sound silly, but you're like, I look around, these people seem happy. And if people that are, and this is true of all aspects of life, if I'm not honest as a minister, hey, here's the stuff that's going to happen if you want to be a minister, then I expect you to have a much rougher time than you have to, because we are constantly experiencing reality or assessing reality by our expectations. And so this is the challenge, that when a person is divorced, when a person is contemplating divorce, those of us that come alongside them to support them, we need to approach with an enormous amount of grace. Because would God say, hey, this is my standard, but I'm adjusting it for you, because I know their hard-heartedness means there's space that God can't get into, And sometimes we are so scared of being honest that we just can't tell the truth. Well, that's space that God can't get into, so our marriages suffer.
Yeah, I mean, I think you talked about that. Let me get the what I need to pass this class dynamic of how we tend to think about following Jesus. And we have this, you said something else about the idea that when committing sexual immorality, especially against a spouse, is ultimately devaluing. It's creating a dynamic where we are raising ourselves above our spouse and above God. And so if we follow the dynamic of, well, what do I have to do to pass the class? I can look and be like, well, I've never had an affair. I don't look at pornography. I bounce my eyes. And so I'm not devaluing my wife. But if I am constantly doing things, knowing that they will cause her harm or cause her pain or bring strife or anger to her, what is that if not devaluing her and raising myself above her and above God? And so this is what happens when we have the dynamic of what do we have to do to pass the class. We have this thought that to pass the class, that it's just a simple rubric, and that it and everything that is in Scripture or right in this passage covers exactly what needs to be said here, or what exactly I need to do. When the reality is, Jesus is not prescribing, here is everything that is here is the only important thing to your marriage. Here's the only important way to make sure that your marriage is healthy and that you are being a good spouse. And man, I think that the way Jesus communicates this is literally genius and revolutionary. So man, I thank you for everything that you were able to add to that, because that enlightened a lot for me. So what perplexes me is the dynamic of he talks about a husband, leaving his home to join together with his wife, and what it is. Because Jesus, there's so much good that Jesus talks about marriage, and so much that it can be, and how important it is to God. And Paul will echo a lot of the same things, and yet you have these two single people who are talking about these things. And Paul will often talk about how good it is to be single, and what a gift it is for some people. It is so hard for me. It honestly is just, it's hard for me to wrap, and I get, Jesus is God. So it's like, okay, yeah, Jesus is God. So that's how he has the answers, and that's how he's so smart. But it's so hard to wrap my mind around the idea that somebody who was never married, that somebody who's never done this, he's the author of it, can understand it so well. And the fact that Jesus never has this dynamic, he never, leaves his family to join together with another singular person, but yet has this reverence for it. There's just this big part of me that, like, I know because he created it, that he understands it, but it's just a hard dynamic. It's not the same thing at all. Don't hear me wrong. I trust Jesus and his teachings on this to the nth degree. I totally trust him. But there is this sense in me of Jesus dealt with all temptation, and relationships and friendships can be just as, I believe relationships, our relationships, especially in the church, can be just as important as marriage relationships. They have as much dignity and can have as much weight and bearing on a human life. So he does. It's not like he's never had a human relationship or never had never invested and never given into another human relationship. But it's almost like when you see even I feel anxious talking about marriage, and I feel anxious talking about, hey, I gave this marriage advice once, because I've only been married for 5.5 years. And it's kind of cringy when you hear young people talking about marriage, because it's like, I'm not even 30 yet. And so I would never give Jason marriage advice, or the general audience, unless I was very, very sure on something, I would never be like, hey, here's some good marriage advice. And you see it a lot of times, like you'll have those Christian influencer couples. It used to be on Instagram, now it's on TikTok, where they've been married for 3 months and they write a book on marriage. And, it's not the same thing at all, but there is this sense of, how does Jesus know this so well? How can he embody this grace and this truth so well? And maybe the perplexion is, how am I not more angry? How am I not more like, well, you haven't been through it, Jesus, so who are you to tell me? Who are you to, like, my perplexion maybe is why do I not feel more strongly that way? And that might seem kind of, and frantic isn't the right word. It might seem a little odd, but it is this, like, you would never, maybe you have, but you would never have like a marriage conference and the main speaker, or the main two speakers or two keynote speakers never have been married in their entire life. It would be kind of a funny, silly thing. And so that's a long rambling thing, but there's just a lot of weirdness for me in how I take this teaching, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying it, because I think there are a lot of people, it is in, that would have that question. If you were raised, if a person was raised and they're like, we question nothing, then it would feel like, oh goodness, how can you question this? But then we can go to the other side of the pendulum. It's like, everything is subject to my judgment as a human, you know what I mean? And so you have those always two extremes at play, sometimes within the same person, sometimes at the same time, where you have these vacillating. What's interesting to me is that phrase, Jesus was tempted in every way, but yeah, you were like, Jesus was never a father, and Jesus was never a husband, and Jesus never ran a company, and Jesus never, these kind of dynamics. And it does make me wonder, is this indicative? I think it's enough to say, like you already said, well, Jesus was connected to God. He says specifically, I don't say anything on my own. Everything I say is from God. And even though he had emptied himself of all himself, it says in Philippians 2, he still, he sets up, that's the basic, at least my understanding of it. He emptied himself of his own deity, and then he was trusting in the Spirit to provide everything he needed as he spoke. So as he's speaking this, or anything else, because like if how much farming did Jesus do? How much fishing did Jesus do? But he spoke accurately enough within that time period that he didn't have anybody say, that's not how that works, kind of thing. So my assumption is the Spirit guided. So that's kind of number one. Number two, though, is I wonder if it's a devil's tactic to make things seem so different as his function of that helps us be isolated. And we can do this even more. So yeah, you could say, well, Jason, yeah, you're married, but you weren't raised in a family like this. You have nothing to tell me. And you weren't born in this generation. You were born in that generation. And I think we do this all the time, that we refuse wisdom because we perceive that my situation is so unique that no one can tell me anything. You know what I mean? And I'm thinking, who would that be advantage of? Well, that's the devil. You know what I mean? The devil loves to create division. And it's not even a correction of what you're saying. It's an expansion on my own thinking, because I've thought this, and I've said this before. I'm like, why didn't we get a single book of the Bible called How to Parent? You know what I mean? Or How to Be a Good Spouse, or a good sibling, or you know what I mean? I would just feel like there were times I'm reading the Bible and I'm like, man, these verses are good. You know what I mean? They're good. It'd be much more helpful on how do you set up a good retirement plan, or, you know, when your parents are dying, how do you handle this, you know? And all we're given is honor your father and mother, and then a general application of love. And so this is really a new thinking for me. But have I created all these differentials in situations? And God is like, you did that, like humans did that. And the devil loves that division, that, oh, you wouldn't understand because of this, this, and this. You know what I mean? Whereas real love would cut through that. For example, we since, I don't know, I feel like in the last 20 years that there has been a real strong push on don't say the wrong thing to people in grief, because it was always they're in a better place, you know, kind of thing. I agree with that. But my submission is, it's not about learning the right words. It's because the people weren't loving in the first place. I tell you they're in a better place usually because I don't want to take the time to think about it. I don't want to be uncomfortable. And I just think that that's one of those dynamics that we judge because this era or this group of people handled it poorly, then there must be no good way to handle it. You just have to follow these strict guidelines. And I think love would fulfill those strict guidelines. You know, and in this case, I think it's a similar dynamic of this idea of Jesus was tempted in every way, because though we have segmented it, you have to experience this to experience that, but he had experienced the universal nature of it, and we could too if we didn't separate it so linearly and so I don't know, there's a better word, that rigidly.
Man, that's really good. And I'm going to cut myself off here. We'll be over here in just a moment. But I talked so much about the genius, that the nuance that Jesus gives here to truth and to love and to grace. And for, you know, lack of a better term, we're not giving the devil his due, and that it's a lot more clever for him to manipulate into these really distinctions that are a lot harder to bring out into the light. If I tell you, hey, it's really great for your marriage to go to the strip club, like that's really easy. Or it's really great for your marriage to never do the dishes, or to to always do what you want to do. Like, it's really easy to be like, that's dumb advice. But if I can then separate it off and be like, well, you don't understand the temptations that we have nowadays. You don't understand how like that is a much more subtle, and I don't mean this in a good way, but it's a much more genius lie. It's a much easier way to get us to diverge from the path that God has for us. And so I think where I'm ending up in this conversation is that Jesus' teaching on marriage is so much more genius and so much more nuanced and brilliant and so multifaceted. And when in my own marriage, I need to be giving the devil his due, and that he's probably much more interested in separating myself off from my wife, from my friends, from all these other people, because then if I'm separated off into that, then there's a lot. It's a lot harder for me to understand and hear the goodness and the rightness and all these different areas. And so I'm going to cut myself off right there, because we could keep going, I'm sure, forever. Though, after the music is played, I'm going to ask Jason a question, and we'll go back and forth. So if you want to listen to that, stay till after the music. If not, it's okay, and we'll only cry a little bit. Grace, peace, and love. So Jason, how do you see, this is the question. How do you see your specific history with divorce affecting your marriage right now in a minute and a half?
Yeah. So, and I do want to say, I could give you a minute and a half and much more on divorce, premarital sex, friendships I've maintained. There's a lot of stuff that has affected my ability to move into the power of marriage. In trying to really focus in on divorce, there is that part that the way that God has built marriage from a child's perspective is this is your safe place. And when that is fractured, it does produce that everything that you fear has already happened to you in one way or another. And so it does come up. I think there is that part to say, it produces that possibility. That fear is there more innately. Now, if I perceive my parents had fantastic lives now and were just like the best, I might even say to myself, well, I don't have to stay in this marriage. You know what I mean? So, and my parents don't have miserable lives or anything, but I mean, I think they would say, man, that was a rough road, So that actually speaks to it, and I value it. Like I've heard people say in their second marriage, they're like, oh, I've learned a lot that I don't want to produce or reproduce in the second marriage. And I'm not suggesting I have that same knowledge, but I do know when you watch a marriage crumble, you do learn, I know what doesn't work. So I would say in that way, there's some benefit, if you will, in that regard. What about you?
Yeah, that's really good. So for me, I think for me, it's produced in a lot of ways it's almost produced in me like a bulletproof vest in terms of marriage. So my wife has very stable parents, love each other. They'll talk about never getting in a fight, for 30 years or however long they've been married. Should have said 40, 50 years just to see if they're paying attention and be like, you're saying I'm 70 years older? They don't talk like that. But a very, very, very healthy marriage, very happy, very loving. And my parents were loving and good to us. But they had a very great relationship with each other, and they're still together. And my parents didn't and aren't still together. And so for Hannah, like for me, I saw all that my parents went through and all the bullets they took before, the anvil finally broke the camel's back. And for me, I'm like, there's a sense for me that when something comes against our marriage, whether it be from myself, from Hannah, or from the outside world, I'm like, man, like I've seen, like it takes a lot bigger bullet to take this thing down. It takes a lot more. Where for Hannah, who didn't, and I'm sure her parents' marriage went through those things and had those bullets absorbed, but because they, it didn't affect, the family life directly, she didn't get to experience those things. So for me, it's a weird thing because like ultimately my parents' marriage ended in divorce, but because I saw how many things it took to lead up to that, there's almost this like, for me, and it can be kind of frustrating, and sometimes I think I could lean into it in a negative sort of way. There's almost this sense of like, man, not like, well, man, I'm doing great in comparison, but man, we've been building this strong foundation, and it's going to take a lot bigger. I'm going to keep using different projectile ammo. It's going to take a massive, much bigger cannonball to leave a sizable dent that we can't repair, because I saw a lot of dents happen and it took a lot of accumulation. Now, that's not the case for everybody, but for me, that's something that and there's 1,000 different ways, subtle that I can recognize and that I can't recognize that it's affected me. But that's one really tangible way that's kind of come into my marriage, is just this like a bulletproof vest where, man, I felt that shot. I feel it. It's going to leave a bruise, but man, I feel like the vital organs are protected, and I feel like we're going to survive. And so, I really appreciate, we really appreciate you listening. And if anybody has continued on to this point and is interested in our stories, that's just really honoring. And we're really thankful that that's the case. Grace, peace, and love again. Grace, peace, and love too. Really grace, peace, and love for you if you've listened all this way.